So, fangen wir an mit einer kleinen Geschichte, das ich habe gestohlen, sagt man das? Gestohlen von Zygmunt Bauman. Das heißt, eine Geschichte über die Trennung zwischen die Politik und die Macht. Und ich habe versucht, meinen Titel auf Deutsch zu übersetzen. Shit is fucked up and bullshit. Sehr schön. Ich habe dieses Statement gesehen auf ein Plakat in Zuccotti Park in New York letzten November gesehen. Ein schöner junger Mann hat zirkuliert während mindestens 2 Stunden mit diesem Statement, sehr ernst. Er sagt nichts, sie war total schweigsam, mit Sonnenbrille, mit Shit is fucked up and bullshit. So auf Deutsch, Scheiße ist abgefuckt und Blödsinn. Vielleicht. Aber Blödsinn ist nicht so dichterisch als Bullshit oder so. Und ja, so Scheiße ist abgefuckt und Blödsinn. So, fangen wir an. I just arrived in a plane. Imagine you're on a plane, up in the sky. You could be reading, you could be drinking, you could be sleeping, you could be playing video games, you could be anticipating a romantic meeting, an arduous work schedule, a romantic encounter, a pleasant vacation, a football match between Italy and Germany, or whatever. This is how it is on a plane. Then, a nice voice, a soft, reassuring voice, a well-educated and welcoming voice makes an announcement. But it's a recorded announcement. Recorded some time ago to tell you that there's no one flying the plane. The cockpit is completely empty. Flight attendants still mill around with drinks. But you have to pay for them with cash, and you only have a credit card. You begin to get thirsty and slightly anxious, and you start to lick your lips in fear. The announcement reassures you that there's an automatic pilot on the plane without a pilot. But then you find out that it's a rather old model of an automatic pilot, and the batteries that charge it risk running down before you land, but still you might land safely. Then there's another announcement about the airport where you're meant to be landing. Berlin, Brandenburg, or whatever. It's bad news. The airport has not been built and is still in the planning stages, held up by various forms of red tape, corrupt local planning departments. Indeed, it then emerges that the application for the airport still hasn't been submitted to the right department, and the construction company that's meant to build the airport is being prosecuted for unpaid taxes. For Bauman, and I think he's right, this story is an image of our age. Right? Shit is fucked up. Right? It expresses our sense of fear, which is a fear of not being in control. We're not in control. But that's not the worst of it. We suspect, indeed we know, that no one is in control. No God, no glorious leader, no malevolent dictator, nothing and no one. It's even worse than the fantasy behind the Wizard of Oz or the Emperor's New Clothes. There's no wizard, there's no emperor. There's just bullshit. So the proposition is a quite formally accurate proposition. Shit is fucked up. Zeitdiagnose, as you say in Germany, and bullshit, the discourse that accompanies shit being fucked up. This is the source, I think, of the massive fear and anxiety that we experience on a daily basis. This fear which comes out of this sense of nothing and no one being in control. And this fear is scattered, it's diffuse, it doesn't have a specific object. The object of fear could be a hurricane, it could be a tsunami, it could be the downsizing of your company. Your wife could leave you, your partner could leave you, your boyfriend or girlfriend suddenly gets sick, or the pension that you've saved for your whole life suddenly disappears. Whoosh. It could be that your house is robbed, your car is stolen, somebody steals your iPhone. You could be diagnosed with a fatal disease. You could be followed by a member of a local neighborhood watch maniac with a gun if you live in Florida. You could be in an elevator with Mitt Romney, or it could be the weather. It could be the weather as a source of fear. The weather isn't the right weather. It's too warm in the winter, it's too cold in the summer. So when it's warm in the winter, we can't really enjoy it because it's not the right time for that weather. So there's this generalized sense of fear, and this fear blocks any sense of, say, enjoyment. I'm not in control. Nothing and no one is in control. It's as if we're living in quicksand. We try and dig ourselves out, and we dig ourselves deeper and deeper in. The more we try, the deeper we sink into the sand or into the ship, the quick ship. Why do we have this feeling of not being in control? Now, we cannot pinpoint the source of our fear. It flows from a general feeling of powerlessness. Why is this? Bauman's suggestion for why this is the case, it's one reason, it's not the only reason, but it's a reason, is a separation of politics and power. Separation of politics and power. Power is the ability to get things done. Politics is the means to get those things done and to decide which of those things need to be done. The location of the union of politics and power was understood to be the nation state. This was never the complete truth, particularly for colonized or subjugated peoples, or perhaps for states in the former Soviet bloc, and it was certainly never the full truth of our always interconnected economic life. But for a period of time in many of the countries of the world, the countries that most of us are from, it was a reasonable expectation that the nation state was the location of the unity of power and politics, and this was how we could get things done. Democracy is the name for a political regime, what the Greeks would have called a politeia, that believes that power lies with the people, whether that's organized through forms of deliberation, assembly, majority vote, or whatever. Representative liberal democracy on the Western model, and there are other models, as the last year and a half has made crystal clear. Representative liberal democracy is premised on the idea that we have political power through the vote, and those votes would be aggregated together, collected by parties, representatives would be elected, governments would be formed, and these governments would have the power to get things done. Parenthesis, personally, as an old Rousseauist, I never really had that much faith in representative government. But let's leave that for a moment. But I think in many ways the major question that we have to ask ourselves is whether we participate with a representative system that is either ineffective or corrupt, or whether we don't. Right? Do we vote? That's a question. It's at least a question. Or perhaps another question is, how do we vote? I've got a practical suggestion that I'll come to at the end. Now, one option here is the option suggested by Alain Badiou, right, in his most recent volume of Circonstances. He says that we should cultivate a sublime indifference to voting. A sublime indifference to voting. This is why he's a Rousseauist. So, a question that faces us, in many ways it's the question, is what the relationship is between association as a political form and representation through the vote. End of parenthesis. Our belief was that if we work politically for a certain group, on the right, on the left, or in the center, then we can win an election, form a government, and have the power to change things. I was, for example, like many people of my generation, someone who came from the far left into the Labour Party in the early 1980s, in the belief that the imperative that was driving politics at that period was the removal of Thatcherism. The only vehicle that was possible to remove Thatcherism was the Labour Party, therefore you became a Labour Party activist. I was a Labour Party activist for 8 years, and I left in 1992, and then after 18 years of opposition, Labour finally won in 1997 in the form of Tony Blair. Right? May he burn in hell, tied to the corpse of Margaret Thatcher. So pragmatism at the level of politics has its costs, right? You should always keep that in mind. The fact is that politics and power have fallen apart in liberal democracy. They're separated, maybe even divorced. We know this. We feel this viscerally, I would wager. And every day, new evidence is provided which confirms this view. One example, it's a slightly outdated example, but I'll just mention it because it's interesting. If you think back all the way back to November last year, the summit in Nice, where Papandreou, the Prime Minister of Greece, after the meeting with the European leaders, went back to Greece and said, I will put the budget proposals to a referendum, to a democratic mandate. And of course, there was horror from Merkel and Sarkozy, right? The Dark Knight and Robin, as he then was, the diminutive Nicolas. They were appalled because they realized that such a popular referendum is a deep misunderstanding of the nature of political reality, contemporary political reality. The referent of contemporary power is not the people and is not located in any local or national government. It lies elsewhere with the ECB, the IMF, and the interests of various financial institutions that the various European states serve. How could someone like Papandreou have been so naive? Things have developed, and if we think about the European situation, it is a sort of case of, it's a case of general clinical depression, right? I was in Portugal and Spain a few weeks ago, 45% youth unemployment in Spain, Portugal in a state of generalized melancholy, which of course it's very good at. Chaos in the Netherlands. The Netherlands. The Netherlands. The Dutch, who used to give us lectures about things were okay, just get along, consensus liberalism. It sort of worked out. Catastrophe, right? Led to the rise of the populist right in the form of Geert Wilders and so on and so forth. Europe is in a state of clinical depression, and the therapist is a passive-aggressive, sadistic, obsessional, neurotic Angela Merkel. That's our dilemma, which is being played out in another charade today, in another bloody summit, in another city. Right? At this point in history, representative liberal democracy is no more than a kind of ideological birdsong. Politics does not have power, it serves power. Politics does not have power, it serves power. And power is supra-political and out of the touch, out of the reach of common citizens. Power has evaporated into supranational spaces. These are the spaces of finance, obviously, of trade, obviously, and also information and information platforms, obviously. But these supranational spaces are also those of drug trafficking, human trafficking, illegal immigration, the many boats that cross the Mediterranean and other seas. We know this. But the space of politics remains the same as it has remained for the past couple of centuries, localized in the nation state. Now, of course, the withering away of the nation state is what the EU was meant to respond to. The nation state is dead, we have a Treaty of Rome, and so on and so forth. Except it's not dead. And it's least dead, most of all, in the most influential nation states, such as Germany, which, under Merkel, seems determined to remake Europe in its image. They're burning German flags in Athens. People should be very proud here. Finally, an imperialist power, right? Burning flags in Athens. Can we call this a German soft imperialism? I don't know. What's for sure is a vicious north-south divide has opened up in Europe of a rather outdated and indeed atavistic kind, and which, of course, is played out in the form of football, right? So in many ways, if you like, the separation of politics and power, right, the fact that these states have become eviscerated husks, the only, as it were, symbolic form that those things can still occupy is a football team, right? Where we can still play out the fantasy of power, right? In the knowledge that there's no power. Even if Greece had beaten Germany last week. Anyway, so in a sense that I could say more about that. Power still feels local. We still feel English or Greek or Tunisian. But power has migrated beyond those local boundaries and sovereignty lies elsewhere. It's certainly not popular. Sovereignty has been outsourced. It's been outsourced to powers with no accountability, no democratic control. Politics does not have power, it serves power. Power is global or supranational, but politics still feels local, and there's a gap between the two. The casualty of the separation of politics and power is the state. The state has become eviscerated, discredited. Its credit rating has been slashed. This is obviously the case with the Greek state or the Spanish state, but I think this is only a slightly more extreme example of the situation elsewhere, in the USA or wherever. The state is in a state. The state, what is the state? The state is a whore trying to attract investors. That's all the state is. Right? The state is a whore which attempts to attract these shadowy investors. So, if that separation of politics and power, it's a very simple diagnosis, and there's a lot more to be said about it, but if that has some traction, then what do we do? The answer is surprisingly simple. We have to take politics back from the political class, the charade of the political class, through a confrontation with the power of finance capital and the international status quo, the people who, a little more than a year ago, lest we forget, were insisting that the Egyptian government was stable. What was so admirable about the various social movements that we all too glibly called the Arab Spring was their courageous determination to reclaim autonomy and political self-determination. The demands of the protesters in Tahrir Square and elsewhere were actually very classical. They were authoritarian dictatorships propped up to serve the interests of Western capital, business interests, and corrupt local elites. They wanted to reclaim ownership of the means of production, for example, through the nationalization of major state industries. The various movements in North Africa and the Middle East aimed and still aim at one thing, the ancient Greek concept of autonomia, autonomy. They demanded collective ownership of the places where one lives, works, thinks, and plays. And that might be thought of as a definition of politics. Politics is the ownership of where one thinks, works, lives, and plays. Contemporary conflicts are essentially conflicts about ownership, about occupation, about the nature of property. Right? The issue with, say, the Arab Spring is why should the telos, why should the goal of the various transformations in North Africa and the Middle East be the state? Why should it remain the state? Why not push harder here? Why not have pushed harder there? Particularly when those states were lines drawn in the sand by British and French imperialists very often. So in a sense, to use a very important category from Antonio Gramsci, the risk of North Africa is a risk of what's called passive revolution, where in a sense we have the appearance of revolution where none of the institutions of that state change. And of course, nothing then changes. Why shouldn't the energy of the Arab Spring lead to the dissolution of those state forms? Be one question. The Occupy movement is fascinating from the standpoint of the separation of politics and power, and is particularly fascinating to the student of Athenian democracy, with its focus on the ecclesia, the General Assembly. To be with those protesters in Zuccotti Park when the chant went up, "This is what democracy looks like, this is what democracy looks like," was powerful, really powerful. What was equally powerful was the way in which groups like OWS conducted General Assemblies peacefully, horizontally, and non-coercively. So given the separation of politics and power, the Occupy movement tried to remake democracy, direct democracy with a mixture of the old, with concepts like assembly, consensus, and autonomy, the oldest political concepts, and the new, Twitter feeds, mobile demonstrations organized through messenger services, and the rest. The Occupy movement has yielded a period of massive political creativity. And like all moments of seemingly spontaneous political creativity, they were for a long time in preparation. Right? So in a sense, what emerged into visibility last year is something that had been long prepared in a genealogy we could trace in different ways. Locally through forms of occupation, and some people in this room were part of such things. It's important to remember that the separation between politics and power, sorry, I'm a bit jet lagged, did not happen by chance or through the quasi-automatic movement of capitalism. Such is the ideological illusion of economism, to which some Marxists succumb, which is why you have to read Gramsci, right? Incidentally. It happened with the connivance of generations of politicians, like Blair, who simply embraced the model of free market capitalism as the engine of growth and personal gain. It's led to a situation where the state is discredited, as is the entire political class and the apparatus of its political parties. In the US, where I live, what's difficult to imagine at the moment is some sort of genuine political articulation between Occupy and the Democratic Party. Sure, Obama has co-opted and will continue to co-opt the language of equality as fairness, becomes a language of fairness for his ends. But I remember one moment in Zuccotti Park last autumn where someone was walking around with a little poster, little piece of cardboard saying, "Obama, comma, please say something. Obama, please say something." It was sort of desperate, but there we are. So we're back at the question now, and this for me it's simply a question of whether and to what extent we participate with the electoral process. Right? If Occupy was a manifestation of association, right? The General Assembly as association, what's the relationship between association and representation? What forms of articulation are imaginable? Do we go with Badiou and say none? Or do we say we need to rethink voting or whatever? I think it's a question that we just have to think through. Occupy is the becoming conscious of a deep dissatisfaction with normal politics, particularly amongst the young. And perhaps it's the phenomenon of politicized, radicalized youth that after 2 decades of postmodern irony and posturing hipster knowingness is so striking and exciting, right? And this is something that if you put this to from people from a certain 68 generation, they say, yeah, it was 68 was all about youth, and, fuck off. Shut up, fuck off, shut up. Get this a lot of the new school. We were there, you can't teach us anything. Now, there's a difference, it seems to me. It seems to me that the 60s generation was hugely important, but it's not for them to give lectures to the generation that has manifested itself around events like Occupy, it seems to me. For the simple reason that so much more is at stake for the generation that's emerged in the last year or so. Because it's a generation which is defined by debt, right? Defined by massive debt. If there's a new version of the cogito for our time, it's I owe, therefore I am, right? So being is being in debt. And that being is being in debt and having no way conceivably of paying that off. And that means that one is captive to forms of monetary exchange for the rest of one's life, is a different experience of being young than it was in the 1960s. I think it's a qualitatively and quantifiably different character. So I think it's important. A general remark, and then it's time for football. True politics requires at least 2 elements, in my view. Firstly, it requires a demand, what I call an infinite demand. An infinite demand that flows from a felt perception of a wrong or an injustice. Secondly, there is a location, a terrain where that demand is articulated. And there is no politics without location. So the 2 key elements of any thinking of politics for me are a demand and a location. What is infinitely demanding? I don't know why I do this. What is infinitely demanding? Scheiße ist abgefuckt und Blödsinn. What is infinitely demanding is the ethical disposition of being open and attentive to what exceeds the finite situation in which we find ourselves. Infinite here does not consist in the demands that I make, but in finding something in the situation that exceeds its limits. I'm plagiarizing from Jacob Blumenfeld at this point. Infinite demands are not issued by a subject, but are the mark of the subject's responsiveness to and responsibility for what is unlimited in a situation. In a concrete action, a wage dispute, say, we might indeed begin with a finite demand, a demand for a living wage, or a right to join a union, or the right for collective bargaining, Wisconsin, or whatever. Such a demand can either be accommodated or not, and that might be the end of the matter. Such is the politics of accommodation. Now, the problem with restricting struggles to what Slavoj Žižek calls precise, finite demands in his critique of my position is that once those demands have either been met or ignored, the struggle is at an end. But there can also be a politics that refuses to be satisfied with accommodation at the level of state or government. In such political actions, the finite demand around which a struggle organizes itself and extends itself beyond the limits of the identity of the concerned group and becomes something more radical and far-reaching is what has to be understood. In this way, the concrete struggles of particular groups and interested parties, defined by region, or gender, or ethnic identity, say, can rapidly become radicalized and perhaps begin to place in question the entire governmental framework or socioeconomic state of the situation. By limiting oneself to finite demands, one loses the radical potential of struggles to extend beyond their particularity, to link with other struggles in other locations and to become generalized. What Gramsci, I don't know I'm talking about Gramsci so much today, it's just on my mind. What Gramsci would call hegemony, right? The key to any genuinely emancipatory politics consists in an openness to the possibility of a generalized struggle that exceeds any particularity or any claim to identity. What is infinitely demanding is that process by which specific, perhaps self-interested or even defensive struggles become something else. They open onto something hitherto unknown about the situation in which one finds oneself. What is infinitely demanding is this ethical commitment towards a possibility that is as yet unknown and inexistent in the situation, but still imagined and imaginable. And for me, that's like another formula for thinking about politics, is that what's infinitely demanding is a kind of commitment towards something inexistent in a situation, which can take shape. It's what I call an interstice, a sort of a gap that can be opened up through activity. So the first element of politics, or one of the two elements of politics, is an infinite demand. Secondly, location. If the nation-state or the supranational sphere is not a location for politics, then the task is to create a location. This is the logic of occupation. Instead of the empty husk of representative democracy and the nation-state, what the Occupy movement shows is the centrality of association. What is required then is a location. If nothing else, then Zuccotti Park taught us that much. If there is no location, then we're doomed to the abstraction of demonstration and the abstraction of protest, or indeed the abstraction of art. It's another question. The other thing that Zuccotti Park taught us is the unpredictable character of location. That location isn't necessarily where you think it's going to be. It might be half a mile away, or it might be further away than you think. At this point, then, it's unclear how the different elements of the Occupy movement will develop. What is certain that they will develop, this genie of popular protest cannot be put back into its bottle. But what it requires is a location, or a series of locations, a series of interconnected sites. I won't go into this now because I'll talk about it tomorrow. But I'm involved, I don't know how to put this. There's this man, and he called me about a month ago, and he understands how computers work. And we're developing this project called orthogonal politics, orthogonal as like a geometrical image of a plane that cuts through something. And we're trying to think about new forms of voting. Because one way, I mean, I don't want to go all the way with saying don't vote. I think it's a disavowal of history, amongst other things, to say the least. But the question of how we vote is, I think, a key issue. Given the discrediting of paper ballots, say Ahmadinejad, Putin, and the coup d'etat of Bush II in January 2000. The question is, why should the state be the guarantor of the vote? Are there other forms of voting available? And what I'm developing with this man who will remain unnamed, we're going to, I don't know, this will happen sometime later in the year, is trying to think about new forms of technological platforms for voting. And this is, what would voting look like in the age of intelligent machines? What would voting look like in the age of intelligent machines? It wouldn't be terribly difficult to imagine. With smartphones, iris recognition technology, all you need is some guarantor, some way of some agency that would be a way that would have some plausibility as a way of dealing. What I'm thinking about here is forms of referenda, right? Voting could be completely radicalized, it seems to me, through new technological means in ways that would be outside of state control. And that would be one way in particular, I think, of getting environmental issues and climate change issues back on the political agenda. Because what's happened through a conspiracy of, say, just political laziness, the financial crisis and incompetence has been that the environmental issue has slipped from the agenda over the last 10, 12 years, and we know that. So how do we occupy football? Well, football is a disaster, obviously. But, you know, and football, obviously, in this country, since the miracle in Bern in 1954, has been the only place, the privileged place, where something like national identity can be articulated in all of its complicated hatefulness. And here we are, 50 years later, you know, with German flags and all the rest. Now, so football becomes the sort of symbolic form for the continuation of forms of degraded nationalism. There's that. And that's probably what's going to play out tonight. But there's also the possibility of another form of thinking about football. Now, my family are from Liverpool, and my only religious commitment is to Liverpool Football Club. And Liverpool is a city which is in England, but not of England. It used to be called the capital city of Ireland. It used to be a joke. But so I was very happy when the English lost last week, playing incompetently against the Italians. It saved me the anxiety of, you know, having to deal with whatever this evening. But the manager of Liverpool Football Club was a guy called Bill Shankly, which in 1959 and 1974. And Shankly said two things. I want to read these out to you. Shankly said, "My idea was to build Liverpool into a bastion of invincibility. Napoleon had that idea. He wanted to conquer the bloody world. I wanted Liverpool to be untouchable. My idea was to build Liverpool up and up until eventually everyone would have to submit and give in." Now, despite the allusion to Napoleon here, Shankly was a lifelong socialist. And it should never be forgotten that the true name of soccer, which goes back to the formal organization of the game in the 1860s in England, is association football. Association football, right? And if you were a rigorously, you know, consistent Marxist, you'd obviously show the link between forms of association in the forms of the industrial working class finding forms of representation and the codification of soccer. The two things are linked. Football is an experience of association. An idea that might even be whimsically linked to that strange moment in Marx's Capital One where he talks about an association of free human beings, a Verein freier Menschen. Could that be a Sportverein? I ask myself. Now, Shankly also said that. He said the following. He said, "The socialism in which I believe is not really politics. It's a way of living. It's humanity. I believe the only way to live and to be truly successful is by collective effort, with everyone working for each other, everyone helping each other, and everyone having a share in the rewards at the end of the day." So, meine Damen und Herren, can we envisage a horizontalist, an associationist vision of soccer? Probably not, but I just want to throw that out there as an idea. So it's now time to watch some. So vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Und morgen können wir diskutieren, aber jetzt wir können das Spiel im Fernsehen angucken und ein Glas Wein trinken. Und vielen Dank.